So far, we've looked at mainstream perspectives on international relations: realism, liberalism, and the identity perspective. Each of these three perspectives offers assumptions and explanations about how international relations works and how actors should respond to world events. But there is a potential that each of these three perspectives, by simplifying the world using their various assumptions, are missing really important relationships and phenomena. And this is the role of critical theory. The purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to some of the major challenges that critical theory makes to mainstream theory, and to introduce you to the three major critical theories in international relations. The key thing to remember when thinking about critical theory and how it applies in international relations, even if you ultimately reject its conclusions, is that critical theory in the social sciences, including international relations, is about revealing the hidden sources of domination in politics in order to facilitate human emancipation. You can recall that realism is the oldest of the three mainstream perspectives, and both liberalism and idealism and sort of modern form of constructivism emerged as critical theories to realism. And over time, they demonstrated their worth, and that there were significant things that realism perhaps was not as effective at explaining as liberalism or the identity perspective. They thus became mainstream perspectives. The remaining critical theories, however, continue to say there are important relationships, important phenomena that cause domination that need to be revealed to the world in order to fully emancipate human beings. There are three major learning objectives that you will address in your readings and online assignments dealing with the question of critical theory in international relations. The first is I need to contrast critical theory with mainstream theory. What is it that makes critical theory different than mainstream theories like realism, liberalism, and identity perspective? You'll also want to be able to give examples of the outcomes that lead to the use of critical theory in IR. In other words, critical theory only is used in cases where scholars or others believe that there is a hidden source of domination. So what are the hidden sources of domination? What are the outcomes that people point to as being demonstrative of that exploitation or other domination that needs to be revealed? Lastly, you want to be able to describe the three major critical theories in IR. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of Marxism and Feminism. Many of you may have heard of Postmodernism as well. But the goal is we've got these three critical theories that each of them identify a hidden form of domination that needs to be revealed, and they challenge the mainstream theories to do that. So the first question that we're going to ask ourselves is, what makes critical theory so critical? And why is it called critical theory? The critical theory perspective, or sort of perspectives, or sort of theories that make it up, it's a much more of a sort of smorgasbord of theoretical approaches that are only really related to one another on the basis of the challenge mainstream theory. Basically, you have four criteria, or sort of four pieces, or sort of attributes. That's what I'm looking for. First off, critical theory perspectives criticize mainstream perspectives for, again, missing important relationships. These may be social relationships, they may be political relationships, they may be economic, they may be cultural. It doesn't matter sort of the area. The idea is simply that there is an important relationship that is being missed by mainstream theory. Critical theory perspectives also explain social injustice and inequality by exposing those hidden power relationships. In other words, when you see an injustice within society from the critical theory perspective, it's because there's a hidden source of exploitation and domination that's going on. Third, critical theory perspectives do not separate events from their deep historical or societal context, which means that they look at the big picture most of the time, so really delve very deeply into the context and to the history of events. And so they don't say, well, conflict is something that just happens in the here and now. Conflict is something that has, is generated by long-standing patterns of domination and exploitation. And lastly, critical theory perspectives focus on description and explanation, not so much on prediction. They're not concerned with trying to figure out what's likely to happen in the future, rather more about understanding the present and how the past got us to where we are today. So describing the nature of exploitation and trying to explain why it persists over time, rather than predicting that it's going to end in the future or that some sort of change is going to happen. And that also separates it very significantly from mainstream theories. So what exactly are the relationships that are hidden by mainstream theory? What is it that gives critical theory a reason to exist in the first place? Well, essentially in IR we have three dominant relationships, or sort of observational realities that lend themselves to critical theory. The first is the appearance of economic exploitation, especially in post-colonial relationships. There continues to be a very strong inequality in terms of the economic relationships between European states and their former colonies, for example. The West continues to be much wealthier than the rest of the world, although a large part of that is beginning to change. China, a few other countries are catching up. But there's this belief or perception that there is, a huge degree of economic inequality in the world. That's a reality. And some believe that that is caused by hidden economic exploitation, or in some cases not so hidden economic exploitation. The second major critical relationship that seems to be missing from a lot of discussion of IR is the role of women. Women play a very important part in the economy. They play a very important part in how societies evolve and how they respond to conflict and potentially for solutions for peace. But they're often ignored. They're left out of the history. Most of the big histories are written about key individuals who are mostly men. So the exclusion of women and the masculinization of international relations, particularly realism, which is a very masculine, or sort of perceived as a very masculine perspective, potentially leads to greater conflict than is necessary. So, the exclusion of women is an important area to look at. Does excluding women from IR matter? Some say yes and some say no, but it's for the role of critical theory to point that relationship out. And lastly, there is a perception, again, some of it true and some of it perhaps real or imagined, depending on your perspective, but there's a domination in the discussion about international relations about Western values and sort of Western conceptions of quote-unquote the truth with a capital T. And this class is very frequently very Eurocentric. The examples that we will use are largely drawn from the history of Europe or descendants of European culture like the United States. And so as a consequence of that, there is an absence of India culture and the Chinese culture and the indigenous cultures of most of the world from discussion in international relations. And so the viewpoint is that perhaps that means there is domination by the West over the sort of indigenous values of the rest of the world. So each of those three hidden relationships leads to a different sort of critical theory. And I'm going to briefly mention each of these theories just so you're paying attention to them. And you should, again, spend time reading the textbook and trying to figure out what really these theories are trying to say. Marxism is probably the most visible, the most famous critical theory in most disciplines. It continues to be fairly influential in international relations in a relative sense. And the goal of Marxism and IR is really about revealing economic exploitation. Marx had various theories, some of which were normative, about overthrowing the bourgeois to lead to the sort of socialist capitalist utopia. But he also was a social scientist who wanted to describe and explain how the world works. And the core of his theories is something called historical materialism. And he says that societies evolve from a dialectical clash between economic classes. And that basically just means that you have different economic classes with different needs, and as they fight over those needs, history progresses. His viewpoint, and the viewpoint of those who followed him, is that the international system today is sort of this integrated capitalist system whose dynamics reflect the needs of capitalism. And that means you have the bourgeois, the capitalist class, and then you have the proletariat, the workers. And that relationship has transcended nation-state borders to now become sort of a global phenomenon. And Marxism as a theory is just it's not trying to explain or focus on creating revolution, but on trying to reveal how those class structures between states have created economic exploitation, and how they have become embedded in the structure of relationships between states. Again, the notion that powerful states exploit the weak. Marxists and realists have very similar viewpoints or sort of analyses of how the world works. The difference is that realists view it as simply being the natural state of things, whereas Marxists would say that it is exploitation and it could be changed given sufficient awareness of the exploitation. Feminists and feminist IR is another critical perspective that I think needs to be highlighted much more than it currently is in the discipline. But the idea of feminism is based on a conception or an idea called reflectionism. Reflectionism is just looking at sort of internally at sort of people's roles and places and where they fit within society, and trying to understand sort of how we come to see ourselves the way that we do. It's very similar to constructivism and the identity perspective in that way. Feminism also assumes that we have all these concepts like power and domination, security, that are traditionally masculine concepts. And one of the important roles that feminism has played in IR is its ability to help to shape the discussions about what constitutes security. We talked about this in the context of liberal theory or sort of liberal perspective, and how over time the increase of non-governmental organizations has led away from a strict interpretation of security as simply the survival of states to a more inclusive definition of human security. And feminism has helped to make that happen. It's also helped to force us to sort of reconsider our assumptions about what IR is all about. So more issues and topics can be addressed in IR because of the work of feminist scholars. Perhaps the most famous work, if you want to tie it to a famous work like Marxism, obviously, is Cynthia and Those Bananas, Beaches and Bases, which is an absolutely fascinating book, and I'd encourage all of you to read it. The last critical perspective is something called postmodernism. And in IR, postmodernism is really about highlighting the hegemony of Western ideas. Postmodernism rejects that there is any sort of theory of human life, or a single theory of human life. There's no truth, right, with a capital T, so it's very relativistic. And as a result, some people say, postmodernism is too relativistic, it can't really lead to anything, but it does produce some interesting analyses. Some critics of Dresner's book, the zombie textbook that I'm having you read selections from during this semester, is often viewed. Some critics view it as a work of postmodernism because it's essentially sort of tongue-in-cheekly working through each of the major theories and kind of rejecting them and saying, well, in reality, none of these really do a very good job of explaining how states would deal with a zombie apocalypse. Dresner, of course, would reject that label, but it's an example of kind of the idea that if every perspective is true at the same time, then you basically get yourself into a postmodernist mindset. It doesn't mean that every perspective is wrong, but the idea is that somebody who rejects postmodernism will assume that one perspective is more correct than the other perspectives, whereas a true postmodernist will see them all as being equally valid. Most of the IR work that is considered part of the postmodernist canon examines the use of language to oppress and marginalize certain groups. Much later in the semester, we will talk about the labels that we use to classify states in terms of their economic position, and this is a very weighted debate, and postmodernists have really been at the forefront of sort of demonstrating why that's a problem. It's a reason why we don't refer to countries anymore as the first world, second world, or third world, because the third world is seen as very pejorative, and other terms, developed or developing, can be viewed as being pejorative. So the labels are changed to attempt to try to remove language and discourse that can lead to the oppression of marginalized groups. So you don't have to believe in critical theory, you don't have to accept their assumptions, but the reality is that there are certain phenomenons, whether it's economic inequality, the general invisibility of women in international relations, or the domination of Western ideas and values and concepts in discussions about IR that perhaps need to be reflected on, at least in a general sense. And that's the role of critical theory in